This video is not about Wicca, but the topic at hand is immediately relevant to popular debates surrounding a subject within a wider Wiccan community: initiation. Specifically, is it possible for one to initiate oneself into the craft? This is a loaded and problematic question for a couple of reasons, both, as always, centered upon language. First, what do we mean by Wicca? Gerald Gardner's Wicca doesn't always look very similar to Scott Cunningham's or Ray Buckland's Wicca. Never mind the Wicca described by people like Starhawk, Raven Grimassi, Silver Ravenwolf, or any of the other bajillion people practicing some kind of goddessy, earthy, cape-requiring tradition that they and others might call Wicca. Oh, and did I mention that sometimes it's just called witchcraft, except that might be a different thing altogether, except when it's the same thing, and sometimes people practice both? Yeah, it's confusing. It's also boring. Not here to talk about that. I want to talk about that second problematic term, initiation. Now, in order to have a reasonable debate about initiation and who gets to have one and or perform one, we have to talk about what initiation actually is. I'll also go ahead and spoil the ending. I'm not going to actually answer the question of whether or not self-initiation should be considered valid. It's a lot more complicated than that. Contemporary understandings of initiation are closely tied to the work of three very important 20th century scholars and thinkers. Arnold van Gennep, a German-born, French-educated linguist, anthropologist, and ethnographer, wrote a super important and often cited book in 1909 called Le Rite de Passage. Yeah, my French sucks. In which, based on both ethnographic work, which means he actually traveled and hung out with the people he wrote about, and literary study of primarily European folklore, he argued that rites of passage have three fundamental stages: separation, transition, and incorporation. Here's an example of what he's talking about. In one South African group, boys, usually in their late teens and early 20s, become men by undergoing circumcision. When they are deemed ready, they are removed from their homes to reside together in small, specially constructed huts outside of the village. Their heads are shaven, they undergo a series of rituals, and are ultimately circumcised. Afterwards, their faces are painted and they must stay in their hut for 3 months. There are special dietary regulations to be observed, rituals to perform, and lots of dancing and body painting. I'm being really brief here, guys. At the end of this period, the boys wash the paint from their bodies, burn the hut, return to the village, where there is more ritual and special clothing, where they are reincorporated and begin their new lives as men. This example embodies the three stages of a rite of passage, as described by Van Gennep, really nicely. Boys are separated from their communities, undergo a type of transformation, and return to be reincorporated, their change in status being publicly recognized. Victor Turner, an even more famous anthropologist, later elaborated on this process in his discussion of initiation and its application within a religious framework. Turner described Van Gennep's three-stage process in terms of liminality, which is academic fancy talk for transformation, and the state of being in a stage of betweenness. Initiation, the stage that Van Gennep just called transformation, represents the period of transition from one way of being to another within a particular community. Joseph Campbell was reading a lot of Victor Turner when he was working on his ideas about the hero's journey, and incorporated Turner and Van Gennep more broadly throughout folklore and anthropology. Over the last several decades, anthropologists, religious studies scholars, and folklorists have discussed initiation with an understanding that it is tied, thanks to the above three scholars, to both transformation and community. For Wiccans, the crux of the problem, if you accept this understanding of the term initiation, is that last word, community. Initiation has scholastically been understood to be a communal process. It is a type of transformation from one state of being to another, aided by and within the context of a wider community. Within a coven setting, this is pretty cut and dried. You go from being an outsider to being an insider. Other communities generally won't acknowledge your rite of passage within their own groups because, well, you're not part of their group, and vice versa. It's a lot less controversial than it sounds. If I'm initiated as a Gardnerian witch, then I can hardly expect a fairy, Alexandrian, or Minoan group to automatically accept me and value my initiation in the same way that I do. Because, quite simply, these are different communities. And, as a Gardnerian, or whatever, why would I care whether or not a different group placed any value in my initiation? So solitaries have to ask themselves, what community are you seeking to become a part of? Does it require an initiation? Why is an initiation into this community valuable, and what does it entail? If there is no community, then is it, by the definition supplied by Van Gennep et al., still initiation? Might there be other, more effective ways to acknowledge a rite of passage that does not involve the type of ritualized process of separation, transformation, and reincorporation? Sorry, no one else can answer this question.